Now, Paul, I had you lead prayer last Sunday morning, didn't I? Who led prayer? Who led prayer Wednesday night? Anybody know? Who led prayer Wednesday night? Anybody know? Nobody? That's okay if it was nobody. I just like to keep notes. I'm on. It's 9:29 right now, so I'm not on yet. At least that's what this clock says, 9:29. That thing says 9:29 too. Now it's 9:30. So we can start now. All right. Well, we're going to get Daryl to lead us in prayer here in a minute, but not quite yet. So I'm thankful Jared led the class on Wednesday. I assume you all had a good class, and I'm ready to move forward. So introduction slides, then we'll have Daryl lead us in prayer, then we'll read John 2 and draw it if you want to, and Johnny will for sure draw it. That'll probably be passed around the class, and we'll all be learning from that great drawing. And then a little bit of introduction, a little bit of pretest, a little bit of introduction to John 1 through 12, and then we'll do the lesson for John 2 as much as we can. I don't think we'll get done with it, and that'll be fine. So introduction slides. The Gospel of John, we have the idea of either belief question marks or belief exclamation points. I do think the belief question marks is really what the text is about overall, is we see people choosing belief based on all the evidence and other people rejecting belief in spite of all the evidence. But we hope to have a belief that has exclamation points with it. I need a note taker volunteer, and I don't know where my book is that is for taking notes in. I did forget to get that. Anybody, it's okay if we just use a regular book, but there's supposed to be a book that's for note taking around here somewhere. Apparently there's not. That's okay. We'll just use one of these. Who wants to volunteer? Those are the lessons, yeah. Yeah, anybody need a workbook? There's workbooks on the back pew in the middle in boxes. But you're welcome to get a workbook. Who wants to be my volunteer note taker? Heather McCormick. I'm actually have to say nice things about you. That's going to be hard on me. I'm not even sure it's worth it. As far as taking notes, yeah. As far as taking notes go, when we get to John 2 and we're discussing it in class, if you have something that Heather wants to take a note about, be ready for her to tell you just to write it down and hand it to her, because otherwise it's almost impossible to keep up with the notes. At least if the class goes right, it'll be impossible to keep up. So we read this last time, John 20, 30 through 31. Kay, can you see that screen well enough to read it? Read that for us.
In the presence of his disciples that are not recorded in this book, but these have been recorded so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and so that through believing you may have life in his name.
So those are great theme verses 4 to 9. I think that is fair. I just want to go over a few slides in preparation for John 2. Things we must not teach or preach. If we were playing Jeopardy, for $1,000, this might be some things we should not or must not teach or preach, that Jesus was only human, that he was 100% human, or that Jesus was only God, 100% God. You know, let's face it, he is the God-man. Now, exactly how you understand the incarnation of Christ, well, good luck with that. Nobody understands it. How can the God of all the universe be clothed in human flesh? It boggles the mind. Now, obviously, God did that. I mean, when we ask how can it be, that's kind of maybe not thinking about how powerful God really is. Of course, God can do that. I mean, we could never come up with how to do it, but he did it. But Jesus is the God-man. He's not only a human, he's not only God. He's not 100% of either one, if you think about it, although that's a pretty common way to look at it. And for $800, maybe not quite as important, but we must not teach or preach that the Old Testament or covenant was not wonderful and great. The fact is, the Old Covenant was wonderful and great. It's a misunderstanding of what the New Testament teaches to think that the New Testament is teaching, oh, the Old Covenant wasn't worth anything. Some people kind of teach that. Some people kind of think that. That's not the right way to think. That's not the way the Bible does things. But having said that, for $600, this is the point that Frank Fox is almost bound to like, that the New Testament or covenant is not even better than the Old. We must not teach. Sometimes it's hard for me to think about all these knots, but the point is the New Covenant is even better than the Old. I may have that worded wrong now that I think about it, but we'll see. Too many double negatives. And we must not teach or preach for $400, not quite as important that there is some other way to the Father other than the Son. We must never indicate to anybody that there's some other way to the Father other than the Son. I've heard it said before, I've said it myself, I got this from somebody else, but if a Buddhist is saved, it'll be because of Christ. Christ is the only way to the Father. If somehow a Buddhist, practicing Buddhist, were to make it to the Father, he would do it through the Son. I'm not saying Buddhists can or can't be saved. That's not the point of the lesson or the illustration. But everybody, no matter who you are, the only way to the Father is the Son, right? And then a final thing, and this is where it ties into John 2, things we must not teach or preach for $200, that the Bible teaches all drinking is wrong. That's just something the Bible does not teach. The Bible does not teach that all drinking is wrong. You might have heard sermons that kind of indicated all drinking was wrong before. Well, that's just something we must not teach or preach. Oh, give that to Heather. Yeah, that'll be great. You can use that book, Heather. That'll work. So, and John 2 really brings this out, if you ask me. There's a lot of wrong things to teach about John 2, and we want to be careful. But overall, now, I'm against drinking. My background, I've shared this with a few people before, my background is that when my mom was dying of cancer, I was busy drinking. Not all the time or anything like that, but I abhor drinking because I have a personal bias against it based on my background. I associate it with a time of rebellion in my life that, I don't get into all that all the time because I don't think that kind of thing's that helpful to people to talk about how bad you used to be. I recognize everybody in this audience as a Christian is wonderful right now, and I recognize you have a horrific background one way or another. That's just so, no need in getting into that too much. We all have horrific backgrounds. That's, being in a fallen world, that's the way that is. Having said that, I can't think clearly about drinking. I see, drinking does so much damage in the world. And so, personally, the idea of just giving up all drinking and not even being tempted by drinking, that's a pretty easy call for me to make. But I should not teach from the Bible that somehow all drinking is wrong. That's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible does not teach that. And so if I want to personally teach that, if I wanted to preach a sermon where I said, well, for me personally, my background is drinking was a time of rebellion in my life, that'd be fine. If I wanted to use some kind of quote from somebody way back, for some people, perfect, complete temperance is better than perfect self-discipline. I forget the quote to be fair, but it's from like 1,000 years ago. And I think quotes like that have a lot of merit, but that's not the Bible, right? And so we just need to be careful. We must not teach or preach that the Bible teaches all drinking is wrong. The Bible doesn't do that. So we better not do it, right? So let's have a prayer. Darrell, if you would, lead us in prayer and we'll get started.
Dear Father, we come to you in prayer, Father. Father, at this time we want to thank you for the opportunity to come and study your word. Dear Father, we want to thank you for this, your day, the day that we will meet around that table and take our vegetables. Dear Father, be with us today that we will learn something from your word and help us so that we will gain knowledge and wisdom. Dear Father, there are those in the hospital like Millersville and others that are struggling. And Father, be with them and help them so that they can ease their pain and comfort them. Dear Father, there are others that are struggling from other issues. And Father, be with them our sins and go with us as we enter this class. And thank you for so many blessings. In your precious and holy Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Derek. And so read John 2 and draw it. A drawing based on the text, draw a picture that illustrates the text. This is completely voluntary, except for the case of Johnny Shoemake, who I drafted. Otherwise, you can volunteer. I will draw something. It won't be much, but my drawing will be something. I do think it's helpful in learning to draw things. Turns out that as I was getting ready for this class today, that I realized that my workbook is not what I thought it was. I left out 2 pages of an outline that's called the Sevens outline. And so all my page numbering is a little bit off, but this page numbering is right. In my mind, all my page numbering is off. Things I planned on being 2 pages later are actually, instead of being page 25, it's 23. But anyway, 23, 24, and 25 is where this lesson is in the book. John chapter 2. Who wants to be the reader for John 2? It's a pretty short chapter. Good and loud. Who wants to read good and loud for John 2? Go ahead, Jared, if you would, read John 2 good and loud for us.
On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, for the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews had said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised up from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people, and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man.
All right. So I drew an oxen, but you couldn't tell which one, but I did draw one. And a dove, or a pigeon, a dove, I guess. And then I drew Jesus with a whip. And I drew a temple around all that. So that's what I drew. Johnny?
Can you see it?
You're a terrible person, Leon. No offense to you. There you go. That's it right there. Now, Johnny, what did you draw?
Work in progress.
A work in progress. Oh, wow. It is a short chapter. It might not be fair to try to draw it all. Anybody have a drawing they want to share? Now that Leon's broken the ice by having me share mine. Anybody else have a drawing they want to share? No? All right. When Johnny gets his done, we'll pass that around. We'll just see it that way. That'll work fine. Review some of the pretest for class pages 5 and 6. This is, the classes were annoying to me, but anyway, so 5 and 6. I just want to do a little bit of this. I don't want to do maybe a lot of it, but we're not going to try to do all of it this morning. Save some of it for the future, maybe. So, anybody have anything for question number 1? What do you hope to learn this quarter? It's okay if you don't. That's really kind of more of a personal question, but you're free to share it if you want to. If we want to share that on page 5. Do I know? More about Jesus. More about Jesus, what I know. John's a great place to go. So that's very good. What about number 2? Either in public Bible classes or in your own personal study. I will let you answer this on your own. We won't share this. About how long has it been since you read John? About how long has it been since you studied John? Then I do want to talk about this part of the question. It's a long question. In your teacher's opinion, that'd be me, this part is very important. What big events have happened in your life since you last read or studied John? What difference will that make? What difference should that not make? So what difference should that make or will that make? And what difference should that not make as far as having big events in between studying a particular book of the Bible? Maybe you got married, maybe you lost a job, lost a loved one, studied some other books that relate to John, books of the Bible, lots of things you could have done. What difference will that make, Leon, or not make?
The difference it will make is if you learn all these things that aren't in the synoptic gospel.
Yeah, as far as John himself goes, that's right. Yeah, so if you study a synoptic, one of the, I'll just use Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you studied one of those since you last studied John, then you're going to see things in John you didn't see in that study, but that study will help you understand John better. So what else, anybody else on this? Difference that it will make and difference it should not make. It doesn't change the text, obviously, so that's the difference it shouldn't make, right? It shouldn't make it where, used to be I thought that was important, but now I've just decided that particular verse isn't really important because it goes against something that's happened to me or whatever. So it can't make us change the text, but let's face it. A person who used to be on top of the world the last time they studied John, they had the best job ever and had a great family life and whatever, and since they've lost that great job and maybe they've had some family trouble, they're going to have a different approach to John, right? It's really the reason why it's not okay for somebody to study a book really thoroughly, 20 years ago and then not study it since. That doesn't really work because there's a different you coming to the text, and that different you will make it where you can get better and different things out of it that are actually there. We're not talking about getting something out of it that's not there, but that's the difference, right? And then on these other questions, 3 through 7, I just want us to look at the introduction. Who is the author of John? We're not going to read this part of the introduction, John the Apostle. It could be John the Elder. We're going to have a video in another class that talks about that possibility, and that's a different person. But I like John the Apostle. Not lots of people probably don't agree with that, but that's okay. And then the purpose to give faith for life. I do actually want us to read some of that in class. So let's turn to the introduction, page 8 and 9 in your workbook. Page 8 and 9 in your workbook. The subject, of course, number 4, is Jesus himself. The purpose of the gospel, to give faith for life, the bottom of page 8, the top of page 9. Who wants to read, starting on page 8, right under purpose to give faith for life, and read until I tell you to stop? We're not going to read the whole page, 2 pages that's here, because that'd be crazy, but let's read some of it. Who wants to read? Go ahead, that'd be great. So do you have that page 8 right below purpose to give faith for life?
John's Gospel includes some material concerning the beginning of the ministry of Christ, 143, 547. And much material concerning the end of Christ's ministry, 7:1 through 21, 25. But only John 6 contains any material concerning the middle of Christ's ministry, and it is given to show the rapid shift in public popularity from wanting to make Jesus king, 6:15, to lose even his disciples, 6:66, from belief of a lack of belief. The author clearly states his purpose of writing in John 20:30-31, quoted above. He writes to win others to like faith in Christ. John's thesis is given in 1:1-18. This gospel was written for everyone. So John is the gospel of belief. It was written to convince people to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. It does this by giving strong evidence through the noun faith. Though the noun faith is not found in the book, the verb belief occurs 99 times. John records both disobedient faith, which will never save, 8:31-44 and 12:42-43, and obedient faith, which will always save, 3:16, 8:31-32.
Okay, that's good. I appreciate it. That's perfect.
I haven't read in years. I'm sorry.
No, you did good. You did good. So, and so the word faith doesn't occur. You know, that's true. And so we know, just to summarize some of this, rest of this, you know, the word faith does occur in the rest of the New Testament. But when we just deal with the word belief, belief only occurs about 150 times in the rest of the New Testament, that verb form. And so 2 out of every 5 occurrences for the word believe in the New Testament is in John. So this gospel really does emphasize believing, and it is that 2 types of believing that was read about: disobedient faith versus obedient faith. A belief that has you do what God says is a saving belief, a saving faith, whereas a belief that is, well, I acknowledge that this looks true and Jesus is special or whatever, but I'm not going to actually do anything he says. Well, that's not the kind of belief that's going to save anybody. And so to give faith for life, and we're talking about the kind of faith that actually does what God says to do. And so then for a theme, question 6, theme is Jesus, the Son of God. That's at the bottom of page 9 in the outline. The story of Jesus Christ is the theme of the book. The divine sonship of Jesus is set forth in John more than anywhere else in the New Testament. Jesus is none other than the only begotten Son, begotten of the Father, 1:14 and 18. All of John's evidence points to this conclusion, and then the key word, of course, is believe. Like we talked about, you know, it is here 99 times, and so that makes it a pretty key word. I went forward somehow there. I didn't mean to do that. I clicked that somehow. Sorry about that. So the next page, review some of the pretest for class, and then combined with the introduction of John 1-12, the next point in the pretest is about, the next point I want to talk about is number 9. How many signs does John record in the book of signs, chapters 1-12? Well, I just put up something that can't be read. There you go. Something that you can't read. This is that part that got left out of the workbook that threw me off. But it's a summary of the outline you actually do have. And the outline you actually do have is on pages 12-15. And if you look in that outline, which you can actually read off the page, in page 12, the second big section of the book of John is the book of signs. Jesus reveals his Father, a witness of the works and words of Jesus, about 3 years in time period, 1:19 through 12:50. And so this big section is about signs, right? It's about proving Jesus is who he said he was. He proves it. And so how many signs does he record in the book of signs? This is a subjective count to some extent, but a lot of people get this number, to be fair. How many? It's in the outline, to be fair, but how many are included in the book of signs? 7. 7 are included in the book of signs. Now, I do think most people say, some people say the seventh sign is the resurrection, which is not in the book of signs. I do think, to be fair, that's a completely separate sign, and it's really the Father acting, although the Son is involved, depending on what verse you want to go to. So I think in the book of signs, the first 12 chapters, it really is 7 big signs where Jesus shows he is the Son of God. And so lesson for John 2 on pages 23, 24, and 25. Additions, changes, deletions, edits, or improvements. If you have pages 23 and 24, what was from before is on there. The syllabus that covers what we're doing, pages 2 and 3, and plus the inside back cover pocket or inside back pocket of your workbook. I'll just do these counts real quick because some of this is mentioned in the introduction points, these words, and so I'm looking for these every time. Believed is in here 3 times, verses 11, 22, and 23. Know is in here 1 time, verse 9, not verses, but verse 9. Fathers, possessive, is in here 1 time, verse 16. Of course, from before we had temple or house 6 times, remembered 2 times, disciples 5 times, and those counts are right. All these other things that the introduction mentions, they're not actually in the text. Anybody have any word counts or really anything else from the old part of the syllabus that you want to mention or cover? It'd be fine if you did. And it's okay if you don't, I guess, but it'd be great if you did. What did it say that? It'd be great if you did. Anybody have anything from the old part they want to mention? The old part is 23 through 20, the half of 24, all that text that's in there in the workbook. So that's what previous classes have developed over time. I will go over the outcomes because in theory we might want to redo them sometimes. Verses 2, outcome 2:1, be able to tell and comment on what Mary tells the servants. Verse 5, do whatever he tells you. Mary knew Jesus was special. Mary knew to do whatever Jesus said. We should always abide by whatever Jesus says to do. Whatever Jesus says, do it. It is a great thing for Christians to do, for sure. And then outcome 2:2, list 2 things in this chapter that help build the disciples' faith. 1 is the sign of water into wine. 2, zeal for the temple with resurrection prediction. What is another thing that's not listed here? We only have 2, but there's a third thing. It's toward the end of the chapter. What does Jesus do toward the end of the chapter that's, I would say, is pretty faith-building? But maybe the disciples couldn't tell he was doing this, to be fair. What does he do? Right toward the end of the chapter. Anybody? He challenges them.
After he brought them out, they come back.
Tear this temple down, and I'll rebuild it. He's hearkening to some.
Talk about the body. Not. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is one of those interesting things that would build faith in disciples. What else does you say Jesus can do right there at the end of the chapter? What can he do? It might not be really he knew their thoughts, right? It's a pretty big claim, right, that he knew their thoughts. But apparently, at least people he was in the presence of while he was here on earth, he could know their thoughts. And so I don't think they could tell that personally, so it's probably not a good part of outcome 2, but he knew their thoughts, and so that's a pretty impressive thing. Anything else from the old things that came up with? Go ahead, Tammy.
2:17 should not be ignored. That's where it says, his disciples remember that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me, which is a quote from Psalm 69:9. And it's very powerful that his actions made people remember things, and they're seeing it happen. They're seeing it unfold. And I just feel like that's a very powerful verse. Because not only is Jesus cleansing the temple, he's doing it in a way that lets people remember that all of this was set in
So give us that Psalm reference again. Psalm 69:9. Yeah, it makes people remember that. Yeah, I like that. That's very good. Anything else? Oh, Daryl, go ahead.
In verse 4, he tells his mother that, his time has not come yet, but still he does the miracle. How many
Yeah.
miracles did he do before his time has come?
Well, I think that his time has not yet come is about his glorification through crucifixion. So, I don't think he has. Obviously, chapter 1 has some people being called, but as far as actually making them apostles, John's probably not that clear on that, truthfully, from what I can tell. Other Gospels are clear about exactly when that happened and the flow. Of course, Gospels are not always written in chronological order, so it's kind of hard to tell anyway. Having said that, I would go with what you're saying, that the best we can tell, they haven't been picked as apostles yet, although they have been called, at least some of them, in chapter 1. Well, I really do think the time that's not yet come, his time is when he's in Passion Week. So that's all the way at the very end. He's going to do a lot of things between now and then. I think the point here would be not that there was any chance of this actually happening, but part of it not happening would be Jesus doing things the way the Father wanted. Let's say if people knew who I really was, they'd want to kill me. Close enough to true. And so, and yet, for me to die the right way, I can't die yet. And so what do I need to do? I need to keep people from knowing me as well as they might otherwise, right? I need to not perform, in Jesus' case, he needs to not perform signs that draw too much attention to him and end up having him crucified only a year into his public ministry, or only 6 months into his public ministry. His time has not yet come to be crucified, is what he's talking about, I'm pretty sure. Frank had his hand up, and so maybe he'll help out the teacher, which would be nice.
I'm a little like Daryl there, but it was it. You notice the way he went about doing the water to wine. He throws them a curve. He said, they ran to Jesus, they have no wine. And Jesus said, so what? My time has not come. Then he turns right around. After all the hubbub had settled down a little bit, they decided they were just not going to have any more wine. And he says, go fill up those 6 water pots. And then the water pots. And then they do that. And then he said, take a dipper to the host and let him drink it. And his eyes popped, because traditionally the good wine was served first, and the second wine, the not so good wine, was served last. Well, here this teaches us that number one, Jesus don't make no mistakes, but number two, that everything Jesus touches becomes new. And we need to appreciate that and understand that if he can have an effect on us, he can turn our lives around if we submit to him. You see, and it's an interesting way that he works around what you just said, avoiding being the visible linchpin of the whole job. He just quietly went about and did it, and there's nothing else said other than what the host said. Yeah.
And then one thing I appreciate Daryl bringing up, this time has not yet come. This is a phrase that will be repeated in the Gospel of John. You already know that, but I'm sharing it with everybody else. A lot of other people probably know it too, but his time has not yet come. My time has not yet come. That idea is in the Gospel of John up until his time comes, which is John deals with the end of the life of Christ for a lot of chapters, so it's really not that far into the book when it comes up. It's chapter 13, to be fair. And that's not that far in. I mean, it's halfway in. But this idea that he can't be crucified yet, he can't be that type of thing, his time has not yet come. And I think here, he could have made this miracle where it was better known, but he does do it, like Frank's pointing out, in a way that it's a witness to his disciples. But there's a lot, most people at this wedding ceremony wouldn't even know what Jesus did, is the way I would take it. I would say, let's say there were 200 people there, over half of them probably would have no idea of what Jesus did. And so this is really, it's done in such a way that it's not going to get him crucified yet, right? There's no way, because most people aren't going to know about it. But, people do know, enough people know and we know, of course, we have the account written for us, but this is done in a pretty private way, as much as you can be private at a big old wedding ceremony. But I've been off in a corner before at a wedding thing and been pretty private, I guess, to be fair,
That kind of throws up a red flag to the Jews because they talk about the temple and so with these two things going on, I don't see how he skated under them questioning a bunch of questions.
Well, they have plenty of questions for him, but it is one of those things where they're not ready to crucify him yet, right? But he's working toward it all the time. To be fair, he's working toward it, but he doesn't want to be there within a week or a month or a year, because that's not when God wanted him to be there. Jared?
One of the interesting things that this particular miracle brings out when you look at it in the appropriate cultural context is that Christ's first miracle, you started the class talking about drinking wine. A lot of people like to point to this miracle as justification for drinking wine. I agree with you, you cannot preach that drinking wine is inherently sinful, obviously. But that's not really the point of this
No, I know
sign,
more
right?
of this.
But even when we peel that layer back and we look at this, because we're looking at it in our modern cultural context, we're still, I think, missing a very important part of why this sign has such a rich theological weight to it. Because in modern day, if you go to a wedding and they run out of, chicken on the buffet line, it's like, oh, well, there's some more chicken on the buffet line, right? It's no big deal.
I like chicken.
Right. And it's no big deal. That was not what a wedding was at this time in history. In this particular culture, at this time in history, these were huge affairs. They were very important. There was a significant amount of weight on how you were treating your guests. And I think all of us have been to a wedding where you're kind of like, whatever, you've been to a wedding and you forget about it the next day. That was not what these events were. These were supposed to be major milestones in people's lives. Not just people getting married, but people who were there too. And it was so significant that if you were throwing a wedding and you invited people to it and you ran out of wine, you could actually be held liable for doing that. The people who came to your wedding could actually sue you, essentially, to use modern terms, for running out of wine at the wedding. So to run out of wine meant that there was a potential for a debt that had to be paid. And that, I think, is what's really interesting about this sign and this miracle here, is that Jesus, the first miracle that he performs, is essentially saving somebody from a debt.
And from the embarrassment, even if, maybe hopefully the people in this village were reasonable, they wouldn't sue somebody over this or whatever. But the embarrassment of, I wasn't prepared. My understanding is they saved up for this for a long time. You know, it was this huge event. And there would be, even if people are like, well, yeah, that wasn't what it should have been, but, you know, we're going to just let bygones be bygones, there would be a real embarrassment of, well, I didn't plan very well. I mean, maybe the guy didn't plan very well, truthfully, but Jesus kept him from the debt. He kept him from the embarrassment. He took care of it, and he took care of it in such a way that the privacy of it, I do appreciate that just later in the chapter he's not being as private. I do appreciate that, Daryl, but maybe part of why he's being private here is not just that his time has not yet come, but also if he wasn't private about it, then that embarrassment would still be there for the guy, right? It'd be like, everybody knows. Well, sure, they had wine, but everybody knows it's not because of me. I wasn't really prepared. I didn't plan this out right. So Jesus does this in obviously exactly the right way. You know, he does it exactly the right way. There's no doubt about that. You know, there's another religion. It has a fellow in it named Muhammad. Anybody familiar with what Muhammad supposedly turned water into? My understanding. I can't say the word. It's a 4-letter word, but it's not a cuss word. I just know that me and my family have a history of mispronouncing this word, and I can't even recognize the mispronunciation, but it starts with an M. That helps. And it's white. Yeah, that's right. Muhammad, say that louder, Heather. That's right. I can't say the word. I know if I said it, you'd say, boy, he really doesn't know how to say that word, but I can't recognize what's wrong. But that's what Islamic tradition says, is Muhammad did that, and I do think it's a pretty obvious attempt to kind of parallel what Jesus did, but, you know, Aretha.
Wine and what we have now, and they said back then it was watered down. They would take the grapes and have the fermentation, but they would add 3 times the amount of water to it. So it was so watered down compared to what we have today that they would have to just drink booze of it to get drunk.
Yeah, and that's covered. I appreciate that. That's covered at the top of page 24, under anything and everything. I do think that's fair points. What would be unfair, like I said earlier, I'm as much against drinking, and it's really for personal reasons. Like I say, you know, when you are busy drinking while your mother's dying, it kind of scars you a little bit. I'm just saying, it scars you just a little. As far as, you know, you're going to be biased. I mean, I'm biased. But we just need to get away from it. And we need to be careful. I mean, there's been sermons preached here since I've been here. I think for sure the person did not preach that all drinking was wrong. But, I mean, they didn't literally say those words. They didn't literally say those words. And so I appreciate that they made the effort to make sure they didn't say those words. But, you know, if you weren't careful, you'd think, well, they didn't say those words, but that's what they're really teaching, is that all drinking is wrong. Well, it's fine for me not to drink. It's fine for you not to drink. I think that's a great call for most people, for lots of people. Having said that, don't say the Bible teaches that. The Bible does not teach all drinking is wrong. Don't even indicate the Bible. You know, don't kind of dance all around it and make sure people can't say, well, you know, he didn't literally say that all drinking's wrong. Well, yeah, but oh, he sure didn't mean it. We don't need to be teaching that. That's not good Bible teaching. Now, I think it's fair to point out, the best we can tell, the Jews weren't just a bunch of drunks. You know, they actually respected, although they got the law of Moses wrong a lot, they actually respected the idea that drinking's dangerous and that you don't need to be a drunkard. You know, they respected that. And I think in general, the people at this wedding were probably people that followed that. You know, they were serious about, we're not going to be a bunch of drunks. They weren't using this as an occasion to be, you know, falling down drunk.
We went to a wedding once where they had drinking, and we had to leave. There was nobody to talk to. Everybody was drunk as a skunk.
Yeah, and I don't think that's the way this wedding was. And I think part of how you know it's not that way, Jesus is not the person who's on campus as a freshman that every fraternity was required to have him become a member because he could really supply a lot of great alcohol. That's not Jesus in chapter 2 of John. It's the case that he supplied wine. I do think it's a fair point. I think it's a fair point. I don't know Greek, but the idea that the Greek language didn't have two different words for grape juice and another word for wine is kind of crazy, right? It's a real language. There is a language called Tokipono that has just a little bit over 100 words and less than 200. Now that language doesn't have probably separate words for grape juice and alcohol, right? It probably does because
It doesn't have a word for either of those.
it doesn't have words for a lot of things because it doesn't have many words. But Greek was an actual functioning language. And it had separate words for things. And so if it was just grape juice, it would have said grape juice, right? If it's wine, I do think they drank it diluted. I think that's a point that's in general true. Gordon, and that'll be it.
In light of what the beginning of Proverbs chapter 20 says, and then also Proverbs 23 in the middle of the chapter, and the way I read that, it's talking about the consequences. In 20 it says, wine is a mocker, strong drink, a brawler, one version. And then in 23 it mentions the consequences seem to be pretty severe. It talks about, it goes down smooth to the life like a snake, stings like a viper. A viper a sting of a viper today would be in most cases deadly. And then if you go to 1 Corinthians 6, where it lists the ones who won't inherit the kingdom of God, idolaters, fornicators, drunkards. So in light of those scriptures, I agree that it doesn't say you can't do it, but I guess if I was talking to someone, would you, how would you word it to someone who has questions on that? Like, the consequences of alcohol can lead to sin.
Yeah, all right. I think you just have to read the passage and just say, you need to be warned that drinking can cause a lot of trouble. And maybe just leave it up to them exactly what they do with that. Because we just need to we have not been careful enough in this area, I think. And I say that as somebody that hasn't taken a drink in a long, long, long time. I'm not in favor of drinking. But I'm certainly against teaching all drinking is wrong when the Bible, and acting like that's what the Bible teaches. That's not what the Bible teaches. Do not teach that. We do not want to teach what the Bible does not teach as if the Bible teaches it on any subject, right? But it is true. Be careful, right? And some people's being careful will be like me. Well, I don't want to have anything to do with it, mainly because of my background. But having said that, I don't think that's bad advice for anybody. But don't say the Bible teaches something it doesn't teach. And that's true in every area. We need to be careful in every area. Only teach what the Bible teaches. We used to say, it is an extra biblical saying, but speak where the Bible speaks, be silent where the Bible's silent. I do think that's a good approach when it comes to the Bible, right? Thank you all very much.